In this video, I'll be covering on how the provided weapon sample works within the generic slot inventory component package. Now, your weapon system might not have to work this way. This is just an example on how to drive a weapon system. In fact, this same component drives the generic shooter weapon system, which works slightly differently, but the core concepts are the same. I strongly recommend that you study up the previous concept videos because this video will kind of assume that you know most of the item info concepts before coming into this video. Now, as you can see, when I select a weapon, I immediately switch to that weapon and I'm able to fire it and use it how I please. Now, this weapon is spawned in our hands instead of being spawned in the world like, say, the cube or the memory target actor. So how is this accomplished? Well, first we'll take a look at this class called the Slot Inventory Demo Item Info Weapon Base. It's a long class name, but what this class is simply the base class that all weapon item infos stem from. Now, there's not a whole lot to this class. First, we have some variables that are pretty important. One is the weapon class that this item info represents, meaning if this item info has a weapon class of the green first person gun, then when this item is invoked or selected, it will create and attach a green gun to the player character. Now we have ammo and ammo max, which is simply how much ammo is in this gun and how much max ammo this gun can hold. And we'll get into how those are used later. So there's really nothing going on in this blueprint except spawn actor and update from actor. So we'll cover update from actor first. And if you're familiar with the idea that item infos can persist data, as covered in the last video, then this should look pretty familiar. All we're doing here is that when we call update from actor on this item info, we expect a weapon to be our actor input, and if it is, we go ahead and grab the ammo and max ammo and set that in our ammo and ammo max for about We go ahead and set that in our variables here, which preserves the state of how much ammo is in this gun. That's all the state we need to know about this weapon. This is a very basic weapon system, but if you had more advanced weapons, you might want to have more additional state properties here, such as its current fire mode, or does it have any attachments, or things like that. Now, the next thing that has been done in this class is this spawn actor override. So when we spawn an actor, what we make sure here is that we don't want the item info, ammo, and ammo max driving the ammo values of this weapon. We want the weapon to have this definition and for this item info to reflect it, which is why in our spawn actor node we call update from actor if initial spawn using temp actor. Now again, earlier videos cover this update from actor if initial spawn using temp actor function, but again, you want to call this in your spawn actor node very early in your logic if you want the item info defaults to pull from the weapon class or the actor it represents, rather than the item info dictating the defaults for the weapon. So once we grab the defaults from the temp actor, we go ahead and use those values to spawn a weapon of the right class here. Now, when we spawn this, we return it, and this spawn actor gets called not from invoke, but it's called from the player character blueprint itself. And again, this is just an implementation detail. You could have invoke call this, but invoke doesn't return a spawn actor reference. It only returns whether or not it was invoked and whether it should be consumed. And because we know we don't want these weapons to be consumed on use, we simply call spawn actor directly in the player character blueprint. I'll go back to what that looks like once we move over to the character blueprint. The last thing that was done in this class was we override the function getItemBarFill%, which simply calculates how much ammo we have, divides it by the max ammo that we can hold, and gets us a value between 0 and 1 to dictate how filled the background item bar should be for this item. There is a future video covering what the item bar represents, and so I'll save that explanation for that video. So going back to our player character, we can see that when we select an item, we have these two branches of logic. The last video covered the second branch. Basically, it covers non-item selection. But this first branch handles what happens if we do select a weapon. And in that case, if we cast our selected item to this item info weapon base class, which means no matter what weapon this item info is, because all item infos for weapons are expected to derive from this base class, we can assume that if this cast succeeds, we're definitely selecting a weapon. Now, for the first thing we do is we check to see if we have a weapon already equipped. This weapon value in our player character blueprint represents the actual weapon actor that's attached to our hands, not an inventory item, but the weapon itself. So if we're switching to a different weapon, we should just destroy the current weapon if it exists. If it doesn't exist and we don't have a weapon equipped, great, then we don't need to do anything. But this is important to make sure that we're not equipping two different weapons, right? Now, the next thing we do is we take the item info, the selected weapon item, and we pass it to a function defined in the player character blueprint called spawn and attach weapon from info. Now, if you have your own custom player character blueprint, this is a function that you're going to want to write yourself. What this handles is it handles taking in an item info object and then properly spawning the weapon it represents and attaching it to your player for whatever that means in your project. Now, here is the spawn actor call that I discussed earlier, which in this weapon item info pulls its default from the temp actor, then spawns a weapon of the given class. Then we cast that to a weapon base, and it's assumed that this should always be a valid weapon, because if not, then we are somehow calling this logic when a weapon was not selected, which is bad. After we have the spawned weapon actor, we immediately attach it to ourselves. Now, the player character blueprint I provided has a function called attach weapon that does this. However, the concept of attaching a weapon to your player character is going to be dependent based on your game and how your character is defined. If we open this up, you'll see that all this does is first it returns early if the provided weapon is not valid, since we simply can't attach something that isn't valid. And we take that weapon actor and we attach it to our first person weapon attach point. If we go to our viewport, you'll see that this weapon attach point is simply a scene component that is bound to the right hand socket of my first person arms. So that if your weapon system has a first and third person implementation, you're going to have to handle that here yourself. What it means to attach a weapon to the character is completely dependent on the character logic, and therefore that's not provided for you. Now in generic shooter, this is all handled by a weapon manager component. In generic shooter, the slot inventory component simply creates the weapon actor and hands off that weapon actor to the weapon manager component, and the weapon manager component deals with all that itself. But that component isn't included in the system, and so if you're rolling your own, you have to be aware of, again, how a weapon attaches to your player character. In fact, you probably already have this logic set up if you have a working weapon system. You just need to have your slot inventory component to tell this logic to run and to drive itself. Now, once we have attached that weapon, we're simply storing a reference to this weapon in this player character blueprint. That way, the player character blueprint can easily reference its equipped weapon. Now, after we attach the weapon, setting the gameplay active item in the slot inventory component allows us to get an event if this item is ever removed or stripped from the user's inventory, but it also allows the UI to handle a little bit better when you're swapping through items or cycling through items in a slot. In essence, it allows us to make sure that we don't select the same weapon twice. For example, if I have a red gun and a green gun in my inventory, you'll see that if I open up my 2 slot, my red gun is initially selected. But now that my red gun is equipped, if I press the 2 slot again, you'll see that instead of highlighting the red gun initially, it knows to skip that and goes directly to my green gun. Just as if I have my green gun selected, it knows to select the red gun instead. And all of that is handled internally. So that's pretty much all there is to it when it comes to selecting and equipping a weapon. But there's some additional details that we need to work out. Now that we have attaching a weapon to ourselves, and we have set the gameplay active item for a better user experience and to keep track of that item we have equipped, what happens if, for instance, the weapon that we have equipped gets stripped from our inventory? What I mean by that is, say we have the green gun selected, and we walk into this box here that removes all green guns. Now you can think of this as dropping an item or having it shipped by an admin, or whatever case that you are removing the item that you have currently equipped. How do we handle that case? You'll see that in this example we automatically switch back to the white gun, which happens to be the lowest slot but the highest priority item. Basically, the idea is that from default behavior, the firstmost slot is your most important slot. So if at any time your currently equipped weapon gets stripped from you, the idea is that you want to select the best weapon, which should be in your firstmost slot. So how is this achieved? Well, the slot inventory component has a function that you can bind to, an event dispatcher, called onGameplayActiveItemRemoved. Now, the slot inventory component has a few events that you can bind to, such as onItemSelected, when the widget's created, when an item is removed or added, when the selected item is removed, which is a little bit different than the gameplay active item, and I don't recommend using this. This is more for internal use. We have onGameplayActiveItemRemoved and the standard component activated and deactivated. Now, onGameplayActiveItemRemoved is simply the same thing as the onItemRemoved event, but it only gets fired when the item that you've specified as the gameplay active item is removed. And we can handle that through our own logic. And the player character blueprint, for example, what it does is when the equipped weapon is removed, which is the only scenario in which the gameplay active item is removed, then we grab the highest priority item in lowest slot. This is a helper function that gets us the so-called best item, and we filter it to be a weapon class because we don't want to accidentally select like the cube item or something like that. We're replacing this weapon with another weapon, so this filter class is a convenient way of only looking for our best weapon. And once we have this item info, we simply call the spawn and attach logic, which kind of fakes that we're reselecting this better item. And when we go through this logic again, we spawn the actor, we attach the weapon, and we set this gameplay active item. And by doing so, we essentially replace the weapon that's active. So, very easy way to respond to that event. Now, one of the last things we need to do is make it so that we have a default inventory of some kind. So we have a default weapon. And how we do that is simply on begin play, if we're the server, we go ahead and we grant the default weapons for this player character blueprint. And again, this is a function that is implemented in the player character blueprint, and you can handle this your own way, and this is completely optional. You don't have to have default items for your character, but if you'd like, here is one way to do it, and that's simply on begin play. Go ahead and call into your slot inventory component and call that add item from item info class that was discussed previously, and add your weapon item info like you would add any other item. And then if you want to add multiple items here, you could just simply copy paste this node, pop in another item, and it'll add both. Now, one thing to remember is that if you're adding multiple items, it's a good performance optimization to uncheck rebuild bar until the last item, meaning if rebuild bar is checked, it refreshes the UI, which is kind of an expensive operation. So if you're adding 6 items, go ahead and do not rebuild the bar until the last item is added, and that'll save you a little bit of performance. Now, after we've added those items, we need to select one of those items. And instead of just telling the inventory component to fake select an item, we simply just run the logic that would happen if it were to be selected, such as spawn and attach weapon from info. And this way, when the player character is spawned, it grabs its inventory, and it simply just adds that first item, this default item that we've given it, into our hands, and we move on. And that's pretty much all of the slot inventory's component. That's pretty much all the slot inventory component's involvement with this weapon system. There is additional stuff where, in order to fire the weapon, and in order to select a weapon, for example, we have it so that the left mouse button both commits to the selected item, meaning if our UI is open and we left click, what we should be doing is we should be trying to select an item that we have hovered. For example, if I left click right now, there's no UI, so I'm not doing anything. But if the menu is open and I left click, then I am committing to that selection of that first item. If I go ahead and grab another item here, and if I select this print string item, when I left click, this is called committing to that selection of that item. And if we should consume this input, this isn't consuming what was selected. This is whether or not the input that led us to commit to selected should be consumed, meaning we did something to this. If this is not true, meaning if we should not consume it, we'll then just fire our weapon. If this should be consumed, we'll simply do nothing, because then the inventory component will handle the selection and the committing action that brings up the new weapon or uses the new item or whatever it should be doing. The last implementation detail about this weapon system and the slot inventory component is how ammo is persisted. Now, we already covered how ammo is persisted when this item spawns an actor, and then we have this update from actor. But where does update from actor get called? This gets called from the weapon itself. Every time we fire our weapon, you'll see that I'm now out of ammo and I can't fire anymore. This is achieved by the weapon actor itself. So if I pull up the gun blueprint, and I have a weapon base that I use for all my weapons here, I have your standard fire replication stuff and your standard when you fire you should consume ammo logic, you should play an animation. Here we're spawning a projectile when we fire. But the important thing in order for this to work with the inventory setup is that whenever you consume ammo, you update this in the item info. Now, here you'll see that I'm not calling update from actor directly. Instead, I know that I want to set the ammo property in the item info, and when this weapon is spawned, this item info is exposed on spawn, and it's expected to accept the item info that this weapon is linked to. So when we fire the weapon, we simply look into this item info directly and set its new ammo property every time we fire. And this keeps the item info in check. Another thing we could do is, if you didn't want to come in here and set a specific property, you could just call update from actor on this item info and then pass in self as the actor. Now, this will have the side effect of setting the ammo and the ammo max, because, that is how this update actor is defined, which is not bad. But again, this is just a way that you can set that up. For the example, I chose to set the ammo value directly just to show you that I can. But either way, as long as the item info state gets updated when it should, that is all you need to do. Now, the generic shooter weapon system does this when a weapon triggers an event called on-weapon vitals changed, meaning every weapon in generic shooter has a concept of something very important about this weapon has changed. We need to make sure that the inventory item is aware of this change. And that gets fired every time you reload, or every time you fire the weapon, any type of ammo changes, or anything critical to the weapon itself. That event gets called, and then the item info will call update from actor based on that actor. But again, the core concept here is that if you know an item property has changed that should be persisted, when you change that in your actor that the item represents, you should change that in the item info as well.